A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back once again to HJN Season 4, or in this case, HJN Super Graphics, of which we're going to go ahead and take a look at something else in mind when it comes to more recent games. Something of which that was actually made for both the PS4 and PS5, an early 2023 title known as Atomic Heart is what's on mind for this instance of HJN. And so, why don't we go ahead and talk a bit about that. Atomic Heart is actually one of those games that gives us a supposed post-apocalyptic viewpoint, an alternate history in the 1950s after a supposed World War II succession with the USSR, better known as the Soviet Union. Essentially, this is one of those games that happens to retell a form of history in a completely different way. Obviously, this is seen as a scenario, much less to that of a realistic form. Like, we know that in 1955, there wasn't really much of the Soviet Union invading most of the world and proclaiming a victory in World War II. And in this case, this basically gives us a supposed neo-mechanical and high technological advancement. Something that was hardly ever seen in the 1950s. For one thing, when did artificial intelligence first truly come around? Certainly not in the 1950s. I mean, people hardly ever focused on that whatsoever. There weren't really computers, at least commercially. That didn't happen until much later. And another thing is the fact that there, of course, were the idea of robots and soldiers and droids, and then, of course, the old idea of robots gone rogue thanks to a certain sabotage plot. Well, this game actually does tend to explore all those different things, all the while having a completely different setting than what would have normally been expected. But the main thing that some people tend to find that it's on the more negative side is the fact that it has an interlink to the USSR or Soviet Union. And while links to Russia nowadays might be as practical as simply explaining the biggest, most controversial plot points of all time in a modern day inquiry where nobody would ever want to even think about what those things were like, here's the thing. We have got to move on from those parts in life. We have got to simply let them go. We cannot just simply change what happened back then. This is ancient history that likely will be talked about by a lot of people. And while many of us are going to do our best to avoid getting anything controversial lined up with more controversy, the thing is, Atomic Heart is just a game. It's not just some real-life thing that they expected to happen, but the thing is, it's quite obvious that robots and AI happen to be the forefront of a lot of today's topics. And on top of all that, you simply have the idea of a certain World War II veteran going out there and taking his whole name out on a big run. A run to end a certain plot once and for all. But not just any. A certain robotics engineer and specialist in robotics design had apparently gone rogue and allowed for chaos to ensue. An entire world, known as Facility 3826, to go to hell. Quite literally, in fact. The thing is that unlike a good majority of other games that we've seen over the years, as well as developers and publishers, Atomic Heart was developed by Mundfish and mainly published by the likes of Focus Entertainment. And we know that Focus Entertainment has also had some success over the years, much like some others that we've gotten to know about. But let's remind ourselves, Atomic Heart is just a game. So, let's get started with the plot here, shall we? P3, better known by his full name, Major Sergei Neshayev, is in fact a World War II combat veteran. He's one of those folks who might seem a bit average, but actually happens to be more of a chosen one, or at least one that gives off a chosen one vibe to him. He's one of those folk who not only happens to take his job seriously, but is also a bit on the more typical no-nonsense approach. As in, if he's given a certain directive or order, then he is to follow it, no matter what cause it may be. He's accompanied by a certain AI known by the name Charles, whom is in fact attached to a certain device called the polymer glove. The polymer glove is one of a few unique characteristics about this game, as well as mechanics that you can operate on your own terms. As you probably know by now, it's a first-person shooter, with some world exploration elements, some lore that you can understand by collecting documents as well as listening in on certain tapes that you pick up, and there's also the usage of dialogue, plot points, exploration, and there's also a lot of challenges based on platforming and navigation. There's certainly a lot of ways that you can play through this whole game, and I've seen a good amount of people attest to this game in many ways possible. The usage of various weapons that you pick up, including melee and ranged weapons like most guns, are probably the most common way that you have for combating against the many rogue bots that you encounter. These supposed bots were originally made as a means of replacing a large group of workers that were supposedly wiped out thanks to a certain German virus that basically caused a lot of problems for the Soviet Union. In this timeline, according to the game's plot, before World War II came to an end and Germany surrendered, the Nazis had apparently unleashed a massive virus on the world. Yeah, if you basically thought that was crazy, well, this brown plague, as it's referred to, apparently left millions dead. And it did, in fact, create much higher demand for the Soviet Union to allow for robots in order to compensate for the large amounts of workers that were wiped out. And on top of all that, this point that takes place about 10 years after the defeat of the Nazis in World War II in 1945, the year 1955 is where the real crap begins to happen. Because even a decade after that massive war took place, the sequel to the Great War of the 1910s, it seemed that for Neshayev, as well as his superior officer and many others, well, the thing is, polymer might be the least of our concerns here. Because while it is an essential material for picking up and allowing for us to open doors, find our own path, and make our way over to the many points on the map and beyond, well, this game also does provoke a series of puzzle solving that is necessary in order to find your way through certain obstacles and of course navigate through certain parts of a building. Yeah, regardless of what place that you go to, what location you enter and leave, there's always going to be a puzzle that might seem to get into your way. It might be as simple as matching the connectors in order to allow for power to flow, or it might be as difficult as, let's say, using Charles himself, the AI that's on your wrist, in order to allow for gravity to change in a certain room. And basically, it's like one of those labyrinth puzzles where you have to get the marble to go into the hole. The correct one, of course. But in this case, it's like if they took it in a whole different direction, added gravity, had magnetism involved, and of course had various objects put on the plane that you have to match in very specific spots. So, much like other games that I've talked about before, I do like how the puzzle element is put in here. I do like the variety that they put in, and I do like how many different puzzles they give you no matter what objective it is that you're going for. There's also some side quests that you can take on. Sometimes they can allow for you to get weapons as well as upgrades to the weapons, some ammo, some health packs, which usually do come in the form of medkits. And of course, these medkits are in fact little more than just polymer implants that Charles can take in and, well, siphon directly from the canisters. The same thing can probably be said about various power-ups, including speed power-ups, strength power-ups, reloading, and many other things involved. There's definitely a ton of elements and variables in this game that do give us a good sense of what we're looking for here. A nice big game worth playing in order to get our money's worth. And besides, I really will have to say, despite the fact that it's Soviet Union related, It sure is quite an amazing piece of mind to look at. The scenery alone, both inside buildings and outside in the open landscape, with a bunch of cars, a bunch of bots patrolling the area, with a variety of different enemies coming every which way. They could be on the ground, they could be flying, they could come at you. And we also can't forget the music. A unique melody comprised of various genres, especially with the likes of electropop and EDM, mainly being the biggest in the soundtrack itself. Oh, but let's not forget about the main elephant in the room here. Petrov. Yeah, Petrov was known to be the primary Roblox engineer, and according to Sechenov, whom is Neshayev's superior officer, apparently Petrov was the man responsible for causing all of these bots to go out of control. He allowed for this whole thing to take place. Yeah, basically, these biomechanical experimentations, as well as robots that are now basically rogue, up against their own programming. Yeah. This apparently is the result of a sabotage plot that Petrov had initiated against something known as the Collective 1.0 node. Yeah. I probably ought to talk a bit more about Collective. Collective is apparently the secret as to what's allowing for all these robotics, these machines, these biomechanical devices, and everything that we've seen in this whole game up until this very point in the title. Had it not been for Collective, the program that supposedly allowed for all this to happen, I'm sure that this 3826 facility might not have worked in the way that it was intended to. The plot certainly does give us a lot to work with here, and we're also accompanied by a pair of ballerina bots. Yeah, as if things couldn't get any more creepy. In any case though, I really ought to hand it to these guys over at Munfish. They certainly were able to pull off a lot of plugs here, and I really will say that through my gameplay experience, from start to finish, it certainly was one thing to remember. And throughout my whole playthrough, I was able to get through at least about 12 hours of gameplay up until the point where I ran into a boss character whom apparently kept firing things at me and was apparently like that of a giant whale. Yeah, as if things couldn't get any more crazier. But let's talk a bit more about the boss fights though, as one final thing that we might as well talk about. I've ran into several different bosses in my whole entire playthrough. There's a boss that happens to roll like a giant bowling ball, a boss that might as well be like, I don't know, Nexu from Star Wars Episode 2? I don't really know. There's not much more that I could say about the game itself. There's lots of things that I will have to say for my own final summary of the game. I do like the variety in many ways possible. The variety in weapons, the variety in power-ups, the variety in health packs, so you can determine how much your health should refill. And I also do like the merchant option here. Basically, there's a certain vending machine whom basically sucks sort of like one of those, I guess, hustlers on the street, if we put it nicely. Yeah, it's one of those things in life. She happens to talk dirty to you half the time if you're not shopping for her and exchanging currency to get a hold of weapons and ammo and whatnot. That's another thing that I do appreciate, at least. The fact that the merchant itself talks to you. I mean, if you thought that Resident Evil was crazy enough to have a merchant of that magnitude, or maybe other RPG games like this, well, here comes this. Yeah. It's definitely one of those games where, even after playing through it all the way to the point where I ended up ditching it for good, I will say, while it's a really good game for what it is, it's not so good in a number of factors. I mean, the challenge alone is one thing that you have to get used to. Because after all, so many enemies are coming after you, from the bots to the biomechanics. And the many bosses that you fight here surely do add to the challenge. And man, the action is just intense. The way that they throw you around and whip you around the room, have you slam against the other side of the room, onto the wall, onto the ceiling, and then drop you onto the floor. It's crazy that Nishayev can take all this abuse and not even have a broken bone. Or it could be the fact that Charles is keeping him alive and all the polymer that he's gotten a hold of up until this very point. No matter which way you look at it though, from his pursuit to Petrov, all the way to the very end of the game where he goes up against Sechenov and his twin ballerinas, basically, it at least goes to show this truly is one of those unique storylines. One of those forefronts that I'm at least proud to say exists. Because who would ever want to get in touch with the Soviet Union again, considering that they basically disbanded as of 1992? Either way you look at it, this was a pretty good game for what it was, but I wouldn't say that it's that much of a masterpiece related material itself. While this does have its controversies, it does have its challenges, and it does have its things that are far astray from what we normally recognize in modern day video games, it truly goes to show we have a lot to work with here. And hopefully we can have even more worth working with in the future, with any upcoming games that we have here in 2025 or anything else in particular. So, my scoring for Atomic Heart is set at around 7.5 out of 10.1. Not necessarily great for what it is, but it still does a good enough job at keeping me occupied and entertained with the many twists and turns, dialogue, weapons, combat, puzzles, storylines, plot twists, boss fights, etc. So, not much more to say here at this point. Although, I will be focusing on a bit of a duology. A duology that has been well known over the years, especially for those who were PlayStation 2 players. And if you might even be from the Nintendo Wii era of things, we're going to talk about the story of a certain alien whom comes to Earth and not only yucks things up in life, but man does he put on quite the show. So, stay tuned for that tomorrow as well as the day after, and I will see you guys later in HJN Super Graphics.